inability to walk, stopped communicating, stopped smiling. She would just sit and stare at a wall and wouldn't recognize you when you walked in the room.
Alzheimer's disease is largely considered a one-way street. Many people die within 6 years of diagnosis. The prevailing treatments at best hope to slow the rate of decline, while recovery from Alzheimer's is virtually impossible. But is that really the case?
Good job, Carolyn. Carolyn, you're on video, hon.
As a matter of fact, Carolyn came out this morning pushing a walker, which she has never done before. Like, she hasn't done that for how many years now? So I was, again, at the stage where I was almost crying because it was just awesome to see that.
So how could recovery ever be possible? In 2007, Dr. Dane Goodenow identified loss of the cell nutrient plasmalogen as the cause of Alzheimer's disease. In the years since, he has dedicated himself to finding a way to restore plasmalogen levels.
The fundamental operating system of the brain is synaptic transmission. That is ground zero of all human neurological function. And this is where the plasmalogen story gets so exciting and scary and hopeful, is because that vesicular transport process is entirely dependent on plasmalogen levels in the synapse.
For Alzheimer's Key to Cure Part 2, we'll learn how memory and cognition are activated, what shuts those nerve connections down, and the new hope for bringing them back online. Welcome to Vital Signs, where we learn how to get healthier from all angles, from the biochemical and nutritional to the things we do that nourish our minds and our souls. I'm Brendan Fallon.
But I think the first thing people need to realize why this is such a shocking situation is the first step is to understand how the human brain works, what actually turns the brain on and off. And you have about 100 billion neurons. Okay, that's a lot. And how big is that kind of thing? And I tell people, if you take a neuron as a grain of sand, that would fill up a small swimming pool in your backyard, okay? So if you had a grain of sand for every neuron, you'd fill up your pool. That's just a cell bodies. That's 100 billion neuronal cell bodies. That's just the body. That's not all of its connections or where it's going from there. And each of these neurons on your brain typically have about 7,000 dendrites that filter out like this. So then each of those things end at a connection plate, which is called a synapse. So if you look at how many synapses your brain have, you're talking 20 football fields, 6 feet deep in sand. Okay, that's how much synapse. And then each of those synapses contain what's called vesicles. That's where the neurotransmitters are in your brain. Little balls with thousands and thousands of neurotransmitters in them. Okay, and each of those 20 football field grains, they'll have a couple hundred of those in there. Okay, now that is the equivalent of all the sand and concrete in the Hoover Dam. Okay, that's how many of these little vesicles. If you take the entire Hoover Dam, grain of sand, that's in your brain. Then you think about, well, what's your brain doing with these things? Okay, your brain has a Hertz rate of 70 to 100, which means those neurons are firing 70 to 100 times per second.
What does that compare to, a Hertz rate of 70 to 100?
So now you're dealing with a gigahertz. Like, you have a human brain clock rate is about 70 million gigahertz. Okay, the fastest gaming computer that you typically buy will be in the 3 to 4 gigahertz range. Okay, so you're talking about 70 million gigahertz, and that is not a binary system. The human brain is not a binary system. It's not a 0-1 computer system. It's a scalar system. So you have each event doesn't have a yes or no. It has a maybe. Okay, so what the human brain fundamentally does is it has such enormous computing power. Like, you think about it. How is it that you can decide to have a chicken salad versus a hamburger at lunch? Like this, every simple little decision that you make, what gives the brain that power is this clock rate. And that is fundamentally driven by this vesicular fusion. Okay, these are bubbles. Okay, so what happens is you have two neurons next to each other. There's a synapse. One neuron has to, those synapses, those little vesicles that I was talking about, those have to merge to a biological membrane, release their content. And it's doing that 70, 100 times a second. And so it's like your shower head. Take a look at like a shower head. And if you turn your shower head off and on, off and on, off and on, that's what your neurons are doing, right? They're spraying neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. okay, in a pulsing manner. And that's how the communication happens. Now the question is, but your brain is not made up of copper and silicone, it's made up of biological material. Like there's actually physical fat, like your brain is made up of these physical material. And so the quality of that membrane is what allows for that synaptic transmission to occur. And this is where the plasmalogen story gets so exciting and scary and hopeful, is because that vesicular transport process is entirely dependent on plasmalogen levels in the synapse. Okay, you can turn the level of synaptic transmission on and off or up and down simply by changing the plasmalogen level of the membrane. And so what happens now with this low levels of plasmalogens, we're dealing with the actual core operating system of the human brain. Okay, so it's not, so when we talk about dementia, which is, there's a very specific cell type of the brain that deals with dementia in your memories. Okay, so first of all, plasmalogens are involved in every single neuron of the body, not just those involved in cognition. But now when we talk about cognition, so how do you have a memory and how do you lose a memory is the next phase of this mental journey that we're going on together here, right?
We'll hear more from Dr. Goodenow in just a moment. But first, it's been my privilege to glimpse the recovery of several patients who are using Dr. Goodenow's treatment, and to speak to their caregivers who have stayed devoted to their loved ones through the hardest of times. Here is the first of those recovery snapshots with the Wires family. Carolyn Wires was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's nearly a decade ago. We first hear from her stepson, Mark.
And she was a nurse, so she took care of people. And I think the challenges for her was the fact that now, as a nurse, she's going to have somebody taking care of her. And I think for her that was obviously upsetting. For my dad.
Can you tell me about the circumstances of Carolyn being diagnosed? When did that happen?
This was almost 10 years ago now, so maybe it's 60. Yeah, so it would have been about 60. My dad's 10 years older. They used to go to Florida during the summer in a way that almost kind of helped, but then they stopped, especially during the pandemic. The pandemic, obviously, there was no options for going out, and that seemed to also have a quite huge impact on both her mobility and state of mind.
So Carolyn was deteriorating, then the pandemic hit around 2020, and then you saw a much more severe deterioration.
Over time, that deterioration started to demonstrate itself by her inability to walk, stopped communicating, stopped smiling, to the extent up until even 2-3 months ago, where she would just sit and stare at a wall and wouldn't recognize you when you walked in the room. Her head wouldn't turn. She wouldn't track you with her eyes. She wouldn't really show any emotion.
How was your dad impacted by that?
To see the deterioration happen, to see the impact on my dad, both mentally and emotionally, and seeing him almost age faster, because he's her primary caregiver.
How did you meet Carolyn?
A blind date. We had a blind date, and I met her, and it was pretty well love at first sight. And yeah, we hit it off, and she's just a great lady.
What was it like before, right before Carolyn started taking this treatment?
Well, before we would get her up, and we would bring her into the room and have her sitting in her relaxer chair. She'd be sitting on the corner of her chair and pretty well sleeping most of the afternoon. Give her her medicine, and I would give her food, and that would all work out okay, but that's about the extent of it. This is totally new. It's been blowing me away. And we started taking the nutrients with the company, I would say, about a month ago? Yeah, be about a month right now. And 2 weeks into it, me and Carolyn were dancing. I had her dancing on the floor. Carolyn used to be a ballroom dancer, so we were dancing on the floor. It was totally amazing.
I imagine at one stage you wouldn't have ever thought you'd be dancing with Carolyn again.
No, And Brendan, and the thing that really, well, it brought tears to my eyes. I told my kids that too. I was almost crying that day, but it was so impressive. She was dancing with me that particular day, and she was dancing with the PSWs, and we had 3 PSWs coming in here, and they were so totally impressed with what's going on with Carolyn. They were almost totally blown away. It was just awesome. As a matter of fact, Carolyn came out this morning pushing a walker, which she has never done before. Like, she hasn't done that for how many years now. So I was again at the stage where I was almost crying, because it was just awesome to see that. And as you can see, she's starting to do she's doing a lot of chatting, of course, and a lot of stuff I can't understand, right?
When did Carolyn first start taking the plasmalogen treatment, and what was her initial reaction?
5 to 6 weeks ago. So not long ago, the first 4 to 5 days, she became really, really active. She started trying to verbalize. She started to speak. It was like 1 minute she's sitting there like this, staring off into space, and then the next minute she's starting to move, look, and say things, like try to verbalize things. Very emotional. So we were kind of playing around a little bit with the dosages at the start, in the way that we were administering them to her. And because she was very active at night and was yelling at my dad at one point. So then we adjusted it a little bit, and then she started getting happy. So then we've been kind of now increased the amount. So the time of day when we were taking the different plasmalogens, and then also the amount. And then, so we started off with doing just the plasmalogens, taking some of them later on in the day before she went to sleep, so it calmed her down. And then we started in with the additional supplements as well that support the plasmalogens in their what they do in the brain. So it was kind of it was like a shock to the system.
How soon did she start having that reaction?
Like within 4 to 5 days, and because she was so interactive, and my dad was like, "Oh, should I not give her these?" Because he was like, what do I do? All of a sudden now she's yelling at me and she's animated, and he was like, is there something wrong?
So, and then when I was in the other room with her just now, she was starting to get really antsy. So then we raised her chair up, and then he helped her to get up, and then she's smiling and she's laughing and she's happy. And so he'd said, well, before the plasmalogen, she hadn't walked in 3 years. She'd been sitting in that chair for 3 years. No wonder she was frustrated now that she's walking again and wanting to get out of that chair. So it's just beautiful.
And the fact that she's getting antsy, that is a type of communication. She's able to express that she's feeling frustration, and that can be responded to. Are there other signs coming through that her communication is improving?
Absolutely. She's able to communicate that way, and yeah, and she's responsive. Earlier today, I heard her say what, and I heard her say yes, and I heard her say no. So she's really learning to be able to communicate her needs and her wants. Has
your outlook for what's ahead in the future changed since this treatment has begun and you've seen these changes in Carolyn?
It most certainly is. I would take her out for dinner in a wheelchair. I can see that day is coming to an end.
That was the first recovery snapshot with the Wires family. We have another one coming up later in the video. It may be that you have a friend or family member living with Alzheimer's. How has their treatment been? Have any lifestyle or other changes been helpful? We welcome you to tell us about it. You can go to epochtv.com and find Vital Signs in the Talk Shows tab to leave your comments. Also, you can share the Alzheimer's insights in this video with friends or family by clicking on the share arrow below. Now we'll hear from Dr. Goodenow about what happens in the brain as plasmalogen levels decline. It just brings to mind, I guess this could be a myth that's potentially busted here, is I think you mentioned before this concept that having dementia is like the Pac-Man eating your memories, basically, or eating the associated cells that correspond to having memories. But that's not necessarily the case, I imagine.
No, and so what happens when plasmalogen levels go down, this firing rate goes down. And so the neurons start shrinking back. So all of your neurons are like a tree with a big root and a branch, and it sends branches out. Those 7,000 dendrites I was talking about, they just go way out like this. And so what happens when your plasmalogen levels go down, you start getting pruning. It doesn't kill the root. what happens is you start getting this multiple Sophie's choices, if you will. The body has to choose, okay, am I going to keep this one or this one? Okay, I'm going to keep this one. And so this dendrite will prune back. And so you don't lose all 7,000 at once. Okay, you use a few of them. And then when the dendrite density comes down, the cell body, and in Alzheimer's it's called the nucleus basalis, it's a cholinergic cell body, it starts to shrink because it's supporting less and less end products, right? So like if your tree shrinks, your roots shrink, like in your root, so that's what happens in Alzheimer's. It's called retrograde degeneration. But that's what happens is you get shrinkage. So this is the part what people forget about the human brain, is it actually shrinks, okay? And so the brain shrinks a lot. Alzheimer's, so the three primary pathological observations in Alzheimer's is amyloid plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, and brain shrinkage. The brain shrinks. It's like a grape into a raisin, right? And since the brain is made of fat, when it shrinks, what it does is it loses lipids. It loses these plasmalogens. So it's part of that shrinkage. And so this is where the hope comes in, because there's actually a lot of shrinkage that occurs before you get apoptosis or cell death. So what's happening, what you mentioned, is not a big Pac-Man. So the brain cells aren't being destroyed and then the brain shrinking because you put holes in the brain and it's shrinking around the holes. Okay, the whole thing is kind of shrinking. Like, you will have diseases like MS where you have lesions and you have strokes, and they're definitely diseases of lesions, right? But that's not what we're talking about with dementia. So typical classic age-associated dementia is brain shrinkage and reduced mental function. And what happens, why we recognize dementia as one of the first things, and mobility. So the two biggest things we recognize in the elderly is cognitive function goes down and mobility goes down. Those two biological functions are dependent upon the same neurotransmitter system called the acetylcholine system. Okay, when your nerves connect to your muscles, your neuromuscular junction, that's an acetylcholine neuron. And in the brain, your memory functions, your cognitive functionings, that's all run on the cholinergic system. And the cholinergic system spreads out throughout your entire brain. So I tell people the human brain has the main operating system. When people get into all this stuff, you kind of have the main on receptor or on neurotransmitter is called glutamate, and the main off one is called GABA. So when people take a benzodiazepine, for example, it enhances GABA, which causes the brain to calm down. When you have inflammation of the brain, glutamate goes up, and you have an inflamed brain, so you have excess glutamate, which is inflammation of the brain. So, but those two receptors make up a huge bulk of all nerve transmission. I don't know the exact number, but it's like 80%.
And this is what the cholinergic system is controlling.
Correct. So the cholinergic system is kind of like a conductor in a symphony. Okay, it's the master, it's the Google search engine so when you have a memory, and the question about memory is, remember, recall. Okay, the reality is a reality, right? So if you go out for dinner with your friends, right, that event is real. Okay, what you ate, what your friends ate, the noise in the restaurant, the smells of the restaurant, the sounds of the restaurant, the time of day, all those things happened. And that's a reality. That memory exists as a reality. Now, the question is, how do you remember that event? Okay, if you get the same smell, oh, I cooked the same food at home, that reminds me, oh, I had the same meal. So that is basically a search engine for that memory. And the cholinergic system is what is your conductor that actually turns those on. And it's like a ping, 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 ping. And you'll know when you get a memory, once you get one kernel of the memory started, the whole memory plays like a song, right? The question is, how do you get into it? And so as we get older, our old memories, we end up with more and more associations with that memory, okay? And the more eventful that memory is, okay, the more we have to search and find it, okay? We have other even internal recall aspects of it. Whereas when we get older now, the younger memories from this morning, what I did in the morning, I don't have as many cues for that memory. Those cues don't exist. And I'm not establishing those cues because my brain capacity and function has been reduced. So loss of memory, loss of muscle function is really more of a loss of recall than the memory is still there. You just can't find it. That event actually still happened. You just can't find it. And then it starts missing things, right? You'll start missing, you'll say, coat instead of hat, right? Or you'll know what you want to say, but you can't say it because that conductor isn't connecting it. So you have a symphony that's playing, and all of a sudden the trombones aren't playing the wrong time. So all of a sudden you get this weird music coming out. And that's what happens when the cholinergic system gets declined. And the reason why the cholinergic system declines in Alzheimer's disease is that it is the most susceptible to a plasmalogen deficiency than all other neurons in the body.
Dr. Goodenow will be back in just a minute. But first, I'd like to introduce Helen and Ted Goodenow. This couple have endured a lot together since Helen's dementia began over 10 years ago. Here, Ted shares a little of he and Helen's story and the results that Helen is seeing from plasmalogen and other nutrient treatment.
They call us Romeo and Juliet, so that's our nicknames. Care home nicknamed us that because they said you guys are always there, you're always together, she's always smiling. So we have an awesome relationship. And so that's helped the dementia.
Is there a memory you can share of maybe going back into the past, something that characterizes you and Helen?
Well, as you know, a marriage of 62 years, you got ups and downs. So we've lived in every province except the Maritimes. From Regina to Winnipeg to Montreal to Toronto, Chicago, Southern Illinois. It's been also a constant change. Our life has been constant change because we're moving, doing things. I think that's helped her. The change, constant change, and maybe that is part of why she can adjust so well. But part of it is just her nature, and because she doesn't create a lot of fuss, she just goes with the flow. She likes to just do what we're doing as a family. She's family oriented, introverted. I'm extroverted, she's introverted.
Ted, I'd like to start just by learning about what the first sign was that Helen was having problems with her memory, with her cognition.
Probably goes back about 12 years. I told my family she was getting dementia, and they didn't believe me.
How old was Helen at that time?
Well, she'd be 12 years, it'd be 75, 74. It was a great gradual thing, and nobody recognized it. But I could when we drove. She couldn't drive in the cities anymore. And then I finally just, about 8 years ago, I pulled the license on her. And I couldn't let her drive anymore. During the day, she did the clothes, she did the dishes, she did the beds, she cleaned the house. The only thing that happened, she couldn't cook. That was the one thing, the main thing. Up till the day she went into the hospital for a dementia assessment, that was the end of the story for her. That's 2 years and 1 month ago.
2 years, 1 month ago, Helen went into hospital.
She went in the hospital for the dementia assessment, and she got COVID in the hospital. She got COVID. Well, then she used 96%, 97% oxygen to keep her alive. And then when she recovered from that, then she had to get the vaccination, of course. And the vaccination almost killed her. The first, she was a vegetable for a month. Then they gave her the second one, and she was even worse. I didn't think she was going to live. And she come through that, and I think what helped there was the supplements that Dan had sent for her to take. She'd been taking for about 6 months, and I think that helped her recover. And from that point on, she had to go into the care home then because now she couldn't walk because they wouldn't let her walk. Went to the care home, they put her in a net sling. And they put her in those the nets, and so she never ever was able to stand up again. And so that became destructive to her because now she couldn't walk. She was tied down, strapped in a wheelchair. My wife, through all this, has smiled. I've never lost a smile. When we got her back into the supplements, then things started to improve. It protected her.
You said that when she was in the care facility, she started taking the plasmalogens again. How long ago was that?
That'd be probably 1.5 years now. Dr. Goodenow said you should start giving it to her. So he sent everything to me to give her. So we started giving it to her.
What was the first sign you saw that she was improving, that gave you some hope?
Using her legs, trying to walk with her legs. That's about a week ago. Then all of a sudden she's starting to walk with her legs, starting to try to move herself with her feet on the wheelchair. That's when I noticed that that was a drastic improvement because she hadn't did that for 2 years.
And what about on the memory side, the cognition side? What was the first sign you saw that there was improvement?
She remembers people that she hasn't seen for a while. Looking at pictures, she remembers her family. In fact, I got a call yesterday from my brother who was in to see her, and he said that she was talking away and she was recognizing that she had white hair and she used to have auburn hair. She didn't recognize herself with white hair. And they tell me yesterday they were showing her pictures and she was recognizing, understanding she once had it, she doesn't have it anymore. So her memory is slowly coming back, and she was talking a lot the last couple of days.
What kind of things is she saying?
Well, she's talking about the past. I built an album of her from beginning to the end, to where we are today, taking her from her childhood right up to the day. And they were going over it yesterday, and she was recognizing things. They tell me that she hadn't recognized 2 or 3 days ago.
As Helen is going through the album, are there particular things that are standing out to her, particular fond memories that she's reminded of?
No, she doesn't talk about it. She hasn't talked a lot what happened to her in the hospital, and the COVID and the vaccinations. So now she's coming through all that. The next step is to get her walking and get her more communicative. She's starting to say, I don't want this and I don't want that, which is a good sign. That she's starting to think for herself, and she's starting to think.
You know the name?
Shouldn't cut it.
Almost. Can you tell me the name of this?
Pencil.
There you go.
She reads, she does word puzzles, and I know what Dr. Goody now has given her has been a real asset to her. It's maintained her and brought her through. Now it's the process of getting her where they need to get her. So maybe one day I can take her home. Well, we've always been together. We walked the world and we both become Christians. That changed our life. And that's 35 years ago. In actual fact, the relationship changed. I think there was more love in it. There was more care in it. Our relationship is together. Somebody said, you got a lot of stress. I said, no, I don't have any stress in my life. I have stress with the system and the adjustment to the system. But the joy is that we've come through it all. And we go closer now than we were. Through it all, we become much closer.
That was a snapshot of Helen and Ted's recovery story. There'll be more remarkable recovery stories to follow in Alzheimer's Key to Cure, Parts 3 and 4. Those links will appear in the description below once published. You'll also find the first Alzheimer's Key to Cure video there, probing what the Alzheimer's gene ApoE4 signals about the cause of Alzheimer's and how low plasmalogens were first discovered in Alzheimer's. Let's take a quick look.
These pathologies, these amyloid plaques, large neuropathology studies have shown that the location of the plaques doesn't disturb neurons around those plaques. And these pathologies are not leading to reduced cognitive functioning.
To get notice of new Key to Cure and other Vital Signs videos, follow me at Vital Signs Brendan on Instagram and that's SEE Vital Signs on X. Next, we'll learn how plasmalogen loss starves the cholinergic system. That's the nerve system that acts as the maestro conductor of our memory.
Other neurons, so this Hertz rate, 60, 70, 100 times a second, it's pumping these neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. Well, it's got to recycle those neurotransmitters just as fast as they pulses them out. Okay, it's not like your water in your shower where the water goes down the drain. Okay, it's got to go back because it's got to recycle these neurotransmitters so that it can keep that firing rate up. All the other neurons in the brain, like a serotonergic neuron or a dopaminergic neuron, all the other neurons, they have a protein reuptakes the neurotransmitter that's constituently expressed. It's always there on the presynaptic neuron. Acetylcholine is unique, of course, all of those things, because it uses the acetylcholine molecule, but then it breaks apart and choline gets taken back up. Choline is an essential nutrient for every single cell of the human body. So it has a unique choline uptake protein. And that protein is actually on the vesicle. So it's very elegant. So when an acetylcholine neuron releases its neurotransmitters, that vesicle, the protein that takes it back up again is on the same vesicle. So what happens in plasmalogen deficiencies is that in the cholinergic neuron, when it releases acetylcholine, that vesicle isn't being fused. The vesicle comes to the membrane and gets stuck on the membrane. It doesn't actually release. And so not only do you reduce the acetylcholine release, but you don't get acetylcholine coming back in. So what it does, it actually causes starvation. Okay, the neurons become starved of choline. And when they become starved of choline, they have to make their own choline. and it's called autocannibalism. So this people that will search Alzheimer's disease, they'll know there's an association with homocysteine, for example. So high levels of homocysteine are associated with an increased risk of Alzheimer's. Well, homocysteine is a biomarker of this choline synthesis from scratch, this methyltransferase system. So when that goes up, that means your body is, your cells are trying to make this choline because it's not coming up again. And then the other place your cells will start stealing your choline from, they'll steal it from your membrane because you have phosphatidylcholine in your membranes. So what it'll do is it'll start breaking your membrane phospholipids down. It'll basically start eating your membranes to provide acetylcholine so that your brain neurons will work. So it causes what's called autocannibalism. This is where it's exciting. So the cholinergic system, we've known since the 70s. So this is another part of a really exciting story for people, is that very rarely do you have in science such clear before and after observations. And one of the favorite studies I like to tell people about is a study by a Dr. David Druckmann. And he did a study in 1977, and you can never do the study today. He gave his students scopolamine. So scopolamine is a cholinergic antagonist. It's a scary, scary drug. It's actually called devil's breath, by the way, if you Google this thing. And it has the same biological activity as roofies. So if you give someone scopolamine, they lose their memory. It's a drug, it's used to abuse elderly in many, many countries of the world. So you can get someone drops scopolamine into your drink in Colombia, for example, because it actually comes from a Colombian tree called a baraga tree or something like that. But anyway, so it's a naturally occurring molecule. But what it does, it blocks acetylcholine very clearly. So this whole thing we're talking about, the acetylcholine system, if you block acetylcholine, you cause memory loss instantly. Okay, and so Dr. Druckmann did a study with his young university students, which of course you could never do today. So he gave these people, his kids, scopolamine, and he could induce cognitive impairment in the lab, clearly. After that, he would give them the acetylcholine agonist called acetylcholine esterase inhibitor. So anyone who has a family member with Alzheimer's disease, you'll know of the drug called Aricept. Okay, so one of the earlier versions of Aricept was a drug called physostigmine. Anyways, that will increase acetylcholine transmission. So he gives them scopolamine to block the acetylcholine transmitter. Then he gives them physostigmine, and he reverses the cognitive decline from the scopolamine. Very clear, unambiguous. I can cause dementia, and I can restore it just by modifying the acetylcholine activity.
And that begs the question, why isn't that method used to treat dementia?
Well, it is, and was the first drug discovered to work on dementia called Aricept or donezepil. And 2 small clinical trials clearly showed that if we block the breakdown of acetylcholine, the enzyme that does that is called acetylcholine esterase. And so you do acetylcholine esterase inhibitor, you can improve cognition. But it doesn't change the trajectory of the disease, right? Because all it does is it symptomatically improves cholinergic functioning. But it does work. Okay, and people do use it, but it only works for a short period of time, and it has other side effect issues. But what's really exciting with the scopolamine story is this, it allows us to ask the question, the chicken and the egg question about Alzheimer's and pathology. Okay, the question is, does Alzheimer's pathology, amyloid plaques, neurofibrillary tangles, are those things actually causing a reduction in the cholinergic system? And so since we know the actual mechanism of the reduced cognition, which is reduced acetylcholine transmission. Okay, that's period, full stop. There's no question about that.
And this has been known since the 90s.
70s.
Since the 70s.
Yeah, so the studies on acetylcholine relationship was done in the mid 70s, all published in 76, 77, so on and so forth. And so now we can take this drug called scopolamine, this roofies drug, basically, if you will, and say, we'll ask the other question. So what happens if we block acetylcholine transmission? If you give animals scopolamine, guess what happens? They get amyloid plaques, they get neurofibrillary tangles, and their brains shrink. Okay, so clearly unambiguous. It's not even, it's really frustrating to have these stories where people are trying to treat dementia by treating the amyloid plaques, when we have irrefutable evidence that it's actually the blockade of cholinergic transmission that actually is associated with that. And with my work on the plasmalogen molecules, we also looked at the role of plasmalogens on amyloid formation, okay, and clearly found that amyloid formation is, when people talk about amyloid, they're really talking about the amyloid A beta 1 to 42 peptide. It's a very specific peptide. Amyloid is actually very, very critical to the human body. Like your brain can't develop without it. It comes from a molecule called amyloid precursor protein, APP. And it normally gets broken down to a molecule called soluble APP alpha, which is an incredibly important molecule. It's what your body uses to brain for neurogenesis. And if you block that genetically, you die. Like you cannot be born without amyloid precursor protein, okay, period. So it's one of the most obligate proteins of the human body. So anyways, it's supposed to be used to create this soluble APP alpha, which is involved in neurogenesis and all that kind of stuff. But a small amount gets processed through an enzyme called beta secretase. And this leads to the pathological amyloid plaques that are known for Alzheimer's. And when you lower plasmalogen levels in the brain, you shift the distribution of APP, how much of it goes to soluble APP alpha and how much of it goes to beta amyloid, and you increase beta amyloid. And the reverse happens when we increase, so we can turn amyloid accumulation on and off simply by changing the plasmalogen levels in the membrane. If we increase the plasmalogen levels in the membrane, amyloid goes down. And it's all related to the cholesterol regulation. And this is where the ApoE4 genotype we talked about earlier comes into. So if you understand how the brain works, the fundamental operating system of the brain is synaptic transmission fueled by vesicular release of neurotransmitters. That is ground zero of all human neurological function.
And that is basically operated by the cholinergic system.
Well, that's operated by the membrane structure, plasmalogens. Now, the cholinergic system is the conductor. It's basically given stimulation of different brain regions, and it innervates your entire brain. And so that's the core aspect of it.
That was Alzheimer's Key to Cure Part 2. We learned about the hope for bringing nerve connections back online through plasmalogens. Be sure to see Alzheimer's Key to Cure Part 3, revealing the steps of recovery and rehabilitation that come after to restore quality of life.
Alzheimer's, it's a family affair. It doesn't affect just the person with dementia. It affects their caregiver and affects the people around them. So I always tell people, when you're thinking about curing something or getting better from something, there's really 3 phases of it.
Check the description below to see if that video's already been published. The link to the first Key to Cure video, Discovering Plasmalogens in Alzheimer's, is also in the description. It's been great to be with you. I'm Brendan Fallon, and this is Vital Signs.